My name is Dr. Liyakat Takim. I teach at McMaster University in Canada. I'm here to talk about my latest book called Shi'ism Revisited, Ijtihad and Reformation in Contemporary Times. This was published by Oxford University Press in January 2022. The reason why I wrote this book was simply because I asked myself often, how is it possible that a law that was revealed and then unfolded in the 7th and 8th centuries, how can that law be applicable today? How is it that Muslims who believe that the law is divinely inspired or divinely revealed apply those laws today in contemporary world, especially the challenges that Muslims face in the West? I was especially inspired by many Iranian youths when I was there in Iran in 2011, and we started discussing on some of the problematic areas of Islamic law and their applicability in contemporary times, especially those laws concerning women, minorities living in a Muslim state, and some of the what I felt were discriminatory laws within Islamic jurisprudence. There are different arguments within the book, but the central thesis that is this main point, the core argument, is that Islamic law, or lots of Islamic law, especially those which are concerned with the society, that is social laws, were endorsed by Islam. In other words, they came from pre-Islamic Arabia, addressing a particular patriarchal Arabian society. Islam endorsed those laws simply because they worked for that time. The Quran came with a certain ethical framework, and as long as those tribal laws did not violate or infringe the ethical framework of the Quran, as long as they fitted within the custom of the time, Islam endorsed it. However, Islam never expected, neither did it state, that those laws were necessarily eternal or immutable or could be imposed on people living, say, 2100 years after that, or 1500 years after that. And that is why the need to revisit and re-examine some of these laws. The structure of the book itself has many aspects to it, because I felt that in order to fully discuss the issues concerning Islamic law, I needed to give a background to Islamic law and the need for reformation, because reformation is a very strong word. Many feel that when we use the term reformation, we are merely buying into the West or mimicking the West. And I've stated in the first chapter, which is the concept of an Islamic reformation, I've said very clearly that for me, Islamic Reformation does not need to borrow from or depend on Western concept of Reformation or Reformation in the Christian world, because the two are entirely different. An Islamic Reformation must be an indigenous exercise that is rooted within the Islamic tradition. Christian Reformation pertains to a particular concept which is not even existed in Islam, which is that Martin Luther rebelling against the church and the abuses by the church, and against the papacy. We do not have a concept of papacy or clergyhood in Islam. So that's the first argument that I'm making in the concept of an Islamic Reformation in chapter 1. I also discuss various changes that have occurred throughout the centuries in Shia law. The second chapter deals with, it's called Usul al-Fiqh and Ijtihad in Shi'ism. It deals with the history of Usul al-Fiqh and history of Ijtihad. How does Ijtihad work? How did it come to work in the first place? Because in the beginning, Shia jurists actually rejected Ijtihad completely, feeling or claiming that it was a Sunni concept and dealing with issues which did not have what we may call any establishment or background in Shia Islam. In other words, it was based on dhann rather than qatr. It was based on conjecture rather than certitude. But later on, I go on to show how Ijtihad was introduced in Shi'ism, how Shia law itself finally came to grips with the concept of dhann or conjecture and came to accept it. Starting with the time of Muhakkik al-Hili when he starts accepting ijtihad up to the time of Murtaza Ansari and his epistemological foundations of ijtihad, and then later on with modern conceptions of ijtihad. In the third chapter, I look at the tools that are used in ijtihad and how they can enable or empower Islamic reformations, why the Shia jurists reject certain concepts of ijtihad, certain tools of ijtihad, and how contemporary Shia scholars are revising that conceptualization and accepting some of those tools that were rejected by earlier mujtahidun. The fourth chapter I would submit is probably the most controversial one. It is titled Reason and Ethics in an Islamic Reformation. And I'm saying that, or I'm arguing, that reason and ethics must have important bearings on the Islamic concept of reformation. In other words, our ijtihad at the time being is too text-centered. Reason has played a very limited role, if any role, in ijtihad, and certainly even ethics. As we have been discussing in the seminar and workshop today, many of the laws are unethical in Islamic jurisprudence. Some of them are run contrary to reason. And therefore, how can we accommodate reason and ethics in Islamic reformation? In other words, the basic parameters of ijtihad have to be reconfigured and revisited. And the final chapter called the Neo-Ijtihadist Phenomenon, I believe that I've stated some of the issues and the deficiencies of ijtihad. Stating what is wrong is very easy. Trying to project what is right is more difficult and challenging. Here, I look at some of the conceptual reconceptualizations of the tools of ijtihad. In other words, how can we introduce new concepts to make ijtihad more lively, less text-centered? And some of the problematic areas depending on Khabar al-Wahid, that is singular traditions, and how some of those traditions run contrary to both ethics and the intellect. So I propose some changes, tools and methodologies that can be introduced to make Islamic law more ethical, more rational, and more livable in contemporary society. This latest book, which I have been describing, took me 9 years to write. It was a long project, but I feel that I should now move on to different fields. And therefore, I have begun researching into Shia tafsir of the Quran from a Shia perspective. I believe that this is an area which has not been fully covered, especially in the Western academia. Most of the academia have focused on Sunni tafsir. There have been 1 or 2 books and some articles on Shia tafsir, but not enough. More specifically, I'm looking at initially the history of Shia tafsir of the Quran, starting from the times of the Imams and the companions of the Imams, and looking at the post-Ghaiba, pre-Buyid era of Shia tafsir, which is dealing with Qummi and Ayashi. Then later on, I go on to examine the tafsir of Tusi and Tabrisi, compare and contrast them and see how they develop from the earlier tafsir. And then I go into the Akhbari era, in the Safavid era, looking at the tafsir of Kashani and Bahrani to see not only how this Akhbari trend appears in their tafsir, but also more importantly, how do they tackle particular verses which were tackled differently by the earlier Mufassirun. And then the next chapter and the last chapter, I deal with modern tafsir, Allama Tabatabai, and I'm going to contrast him with a figure that I'm still trying to identify, maybe Ayatollah Fadlallah, maybe 1 or 2 others, to see how tafsir has been able to answer some of the modern issues, some of the contemporary issues that have been raised. And I also want to look at how some tafsir have dealt with problematic issues. For example, the Shia tradition of Raj'a, for example, or Shia treatment of women, or Shia treatment of non-Muslim minorities living within a Muslim state, how the tafsir on them, not the legal structure, not the Islamic jurisprudence, but how the commentary on the Quran. So my focus is not on the Quran as much as it is on the commentary of the Quran and how different factors have influenced how we see the Quran today.